Jen, are we ready? Good evening. Good evening. Good evening. We're very glad that you're here at the Chester County History Center this evening. My name is Ellen, and I am the curator of the museum and the director of collections. So I get to see a lot of things that are historical, and guess what? Bias is historical. It's also contemporary. And the story behind the exhibit that we have here at the History Center, The Bias Inside Us, is that I was asked a couple of years ago to look into traveling exhibits that we might include in our rotation. I immediately went to the Smithsonian Institution's Traveling Exhibition Service, otherwise known as CITES, to see what they had that was available. And I came upon this and said, aha, this fits into the history of the History Center, trying to do inclusive programming in everything that we do. And so I took a chance and applied because it was an application process. And we were very fortunate to be selected, and as it turns out, the only Pennsylvania site for this exhibition. This is perhaps the second year it is traveling across the United States, and it's concluding its run in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic at the beginning of 2027. I think the reason that we got the installation is because I go back to the work of co-workers in terms of programs and exhibitions that try to talk about local history from a very broad and inclusive perspective. The other reason we could borrow it is because of the generosity of the Otto Griffin Foundation and many other private donors who funded this exhibition. As a result, we got it for free. And that is strictly from private funding. So we are very grateful for the generosity of foundations and individuals. And also a quick shout out to our colleagues at the Chester County Archives. We're allowed, when we have a traveling exhibit, to do a local particular piece that relates to our history, and in the little side room next to it are court cases from Chester County courts dating from the late 1700s to the early 1900s, showing a variety of examples for visitors to take a look at and figure out if there is bias in how those court cases are resolved. So thank you to the county archives as well. Part of the arrangement with sites is that we have to do two programs. Oh, well, we're always doing programs. This is a no-brainer for us. And so we said, absolutely, very possible to do. We are very fortunate to have the panel that we have here this evening. And I'm going to start by introducing Deanna Gonzalez, who is the moderator. And Deanna is the Racial Equity and Equitable Engagement Lead at Strategy Arts Consulting. So thank you, by the way, for Strategy Arts. Professionally, Deanna is an expert facilitator, professional advocate, activist, and equity practitioner. She specializes in equitable community engagement, safer space facilitation, and developing diverse, inclusive, and equitable projects and initiatives. A proud North Philly native, Deanna is a first-gen daughter, mother, and advocate committed to bringing her passion for the community and healing to the community she serves and represents. Welcome, Deanna.
Thank you so much. I am a very lucky person. I get to be your moderator. Ellen, thank you so much, and thank you, Chester County History Center, for the opportunity to be your moderator. Given the history of the center and women's rights, it is truly my honor to be here this evening. Thank you all for being here. I know it's cold out, and a lot of layers had to go on before we got here. And to everybody who's hopefully warm and cozy at home, thank you for taking the time to carve out this evening and joining us in this community conversation. As mentioned, I am the Racial Equity Equitable Engagement Lead at Strategy Art. And again, my name is Deanna Gonzalez. And that's a really fancy way of saying that I'm a racial equity practitioner, a social justice advocate, a community engagement strategist, and my favorite part, I'm a community leader and keeper of community. And what that means is that bring folks together. I make sure that when they are together, they are in a safer space to have what is sometimes difficult conversation. So all that's in you're in good hands tonight. So before we get started, a couple community guidelines that I'd like to share. When we're in community together, and we're talking about topics like bias and disability rights, it's important that we all approach this conversation and everything that we share as learners. So I encourage you all to center yourself as a learner today. Even those of us with close proximity to disability are also learners. We don't all have it figured out. Myself, for example, I am the daughter of a disabled parent. I have two neurodivergent children. So we all have proximity one way or another to disability. And that means that I too have a lot to learn, even though that is my proximity to disability. So I'd like us all to practice being learners tonight. What does that look like? What does that feel like? These are really uncomfortable truths that we'll be talking about today. We'll be talking, our panelists, our amazing panelists, by the way, we'll be sharing history about disability rights in Pennsylvania, lived experience as a disabled person. And so that requires us to pause and expand our thinking when those uncomfortable feelings come up. Because the reality is that bias is in all of us. If none of us are free from it, we all have bias. That's the good news, right? We're all equal in that way. We all have bias. However, it is our responsibility to interrogate that bias. So as we do that, I ask that you pause and expand your thinking wherever you feel comfort. And I'll be engaging with you all. So I will ask Jennifer if there are any questions online. I will ask you all. I want this to be a gathering with the minds. We don't want to just talk at you. We want to talk with you. So in that vein, if you all would please take up space and leave space, we appreciate it. I also like to usually guide our conversations with the words and the quotes of smarter, better people than myself when it comes to certain issues. And our guiding quote from this evening is from Alice Long, Millersville University author, disability activist, and now ancestor. She became passed away. And her guiding quote for us this evening is, disability is a portal, a way of focusing our gaze and sharpening our lens on the intricacies of our humanity. So I'd like to sit with that for just a second or two and think about what that really means as we engage in this conversation.
Might I interrupt really quickly? There's a lot of feedback online, probably from the microphone.
Sure.
Is it possible for you to do this with microphone off and see how it improves?
Absolutely.
Since we're a little bit of a small group here, hopefully you can all hear. And if you can't,
Also,
raise your hand and we'll get closer to you.
And lucky for everyone on Puerto Rico, so that makes me naturally loud. So, all is well. Can everyone hear me? Yay! Awesome. Thank you, Jennifer. Appreciate that.
Yeah, the comments are loud is so much better without the mic.
Yay! Thank you, friends at home. We appreciate you. Okay. So tonight you're gonna hear all kinds of language, and because this is a gathering of minds, if you have a question, I've never heard that before, raise your hand. One of us will explain it. Because a lot of times it can feel like when we dissect these topics, it can feel like word soup, so to speak, right? You'll hear things like mutual aid, ableism, disabled, IEPs, neurotypical, collective, AACs, augmentative, alternative communication systems. I think that's what it's for, right, Carolyn? Yep. So a lot of acronyms sometimes, those of us in the community tend to just like default into our language habits. Please, if you have a question, raise your hand. I'll be happy to clear things up for you. Two very important words that I'd like us to consider and think about and reflect on this evening are the first one, bias. And if you've been to the exhibit so far, this looks really familiar to you. The exhibit has what, in my opinion, one of the best definitions I've heard on bias so far. Bias is a preference or prejudice, either for or against another thing, person, or group. So I want us to hold on to that. Also, really small print there. All of us feel biased, back to what I was saying. The good news is we're all on the same playing field because we all have the tendency to have bias. It's perfectly natural. Bias is an automatic firing in our brain. You like or dislike something or someone or a certain group, even though you may not know why. That's where that pause and that expansion comes in, right? Sometimes bias feels like a whisper. Other times it comes through like a roar. So that's really important. That's where I want you all, if there's a roar, I want you to pause and practice expanding. The brain offers options, safety, fight or flight. So this is the definition of bias I want us all to stick with today. Ableism is the next one that I want us to hold on today. Ableism is a set of beliefs or practices that devalue and discriminate against people with physical, intellectual, or psychiatric disabilities, and often rests on the assumption that disabled people need to be fixed in one form or the other. That definition comes from the Center for Disability Rights. So I'd like us to hold on to that understanding as well. And now I want to introduce you to our friends, because they've got a lot to say and teach, and I know you're going to love them. First, we'll start off with my friend, Dr. Downey, historian, professor emeritus at Millersville University. His most recent publication, Exploring Disability History in Pennsylvania, received the 2023 Hervey B. Wilbur Historic Preservation Award from the American Association of Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities, and a 2023 Special Achievement Award from PA Museums. Wow, I told you. His forthcoming book, Becoming Roland Johnson, explores the life of Roland Johnson, explores the life of Roland Johnson, whose journey took him from institutionalization at the notorious Pennhurst State School in Spring City, Pennsylvania, which, for some of you that don't know this PA history, is shut down in 1987 after allegations of abuse and neglect, to becoming an advocate for the rights of people with disabilities. Hi, Dennis. Presentation, I will take questions from you all here in the audience and at home. So we'll pause for that. But next I want to introduce you to my other friend, Reverend Caroline Cupp, who will address the disability rights movement today as a disabled person. And we're going to be hearing a lot about her books and also her lived experience. Reverend Cup is an ordained Presbyterian minister, writer, and disabled parent who is the author of several upcoming books on disability and relationships. Her books include This Is How We Play, This Is How We Talk, and The Right to Belong, and Dateable. Her writing has also been featured in Yale Divinity School's journal Reflections, an advocate, a mom, an amazing person, because I'm here. So these are nice, because then, then you'll have to deal with me and you want that. So let's begin. Dennis, your turn.
Thank you, Deanna, and good evening. Can everybody hear me? All right, my voice tends to be a little weaker than it once was. It's my pleasure to be back at the Chester County Historical Center. I spent many days researching the lynching of Zachariah Walker, now almost 40 years ago. And book No Crooked Death came out of it, which I'm happy to say is still in print. And this center was a very wonderful host and helped. And so I'm always grateful for the chance to return. I thank Jen Green and to all those who made this program possible. My task tonight is to talk a bit about the disability rights movement in Pennsylvania, with allusions to the national disability rights movement in America, which may be the most little understood and unappreciated social movement in modern American history. It dates from really the 1950s all the way down to today, as we'll hear. It's still going on. And I would like to particularly focus on Pennsylvania, but also on Chester County, which had a critical role to play in so much of what I'm going to talk about. So if I can, I'd like to begin with two quotes, just two ideas to keep in mind that might provide a perspective for us tonight. One is, disability is something that happens to people. It is part of the human condition. The other quote is that disability is our destiny. All of us, all of our loved ones, family members, will in some manner or another experience disability. It can be temporary, it can be permanent, it can be the result of a simple fall, the result of a traumatic birth, or any number of other accidents or incidents as we follow life. So all of which is to say, disability is very much a part of what it means to be human. I did just a little bit of additional research for tonight, and to make a long story short, the federal government, particularly the Centers for Disease Control, recognized 14 different conditions which qualify for a disability under the law. And then under the law, it entitles you to certain protections, certain services, and certain supports as time goes on. Pennsylvania has a critical role to play in a national, in the development of disabilities, disability culture, and also in the disability rights movement. And as we get into this, we should keep in mind the broad categories of cognitive and developmental disabilities, physical disabilities, behavioral and mental health conditions which qualify as a disability. The common denominator or link is access. Access to housing, education, transportation, social services and supports, and other kinds of social conditions. There is a long arc in history that extends from bias and prejudice down to inclusion and opportunity. And that's really what we're talking about, is that arc that bends towards dignity and bends towards inclusion and bends towards a broader sense of national and social relationships. What I'd like to do very quickly is to discuss Pennsylvania's role in a national disability and disability rights movement, giving a little bit of context and background, and then looking at what the results are, and intentionally moving towards Chester County and moving towards Pennhurst and the social, the legal, and the economic consequences of what happened in this very county not too long ago. How many folks know what eugenics were? That's good. Eugenics is a phrase that is most associated with Francis Galton, who was Charles Darwin's cousin. And he was the author, he was a man of enormous intellect and interests and a range of different kinds of areas of inquiry that made him one of the most significant, though little understood, theorists of the 19th century. In 1869, Francis Galton wrote a book, and it's called Hereditary Genius. And it was an addendum, an add-on to what his cousin Charles Darwin had written a decade before on the origin of species. Galton picked up on Darwin's notion of evolutionary development, and he added to it a greater emphasis on the idea of hereditary or heredity and hereditary traits, those traits and conditions that can be passed down from one generation to the next. And he spawned this movement, which was known as the eugenics movement, which comes to have a tremendous impact in the United States and in Pennsylvania. And it lays the foundation for so much of what we're going to talk about tonight. Galton picked up on Herbert Spencer's notion of survival of the fittest. And this idea of us against them, a constant ongoing struggle between the strong and the weak in the survival of the fittest. He thought it was in society's interest, it was part of the natural order to show preference or biased for the fittest, and also to try to somehow minimize those folks who were judged to be the weakest. And the proposition was very clear. He thought of the idea of selective breeding, that you can breed out undesirable traits and they will over time disappear. You can also breed in more successful traits, aspects of the human condition, and that they will flourish. Darwin applied this to the animals and to human beings. If you can breed a better, stronger, more fit horse or cow or pig, why can't you breed a better, stronger, more fit human being? And he planted this notion that through selective breeding, through the hereditary process, you can improve the human condition, not by extermination, but by eliminating and marginalizing those traits that were judged to be undesirable, whether they're physical traits or cognitive, intellectual traits. And you can begin to see where we're going. By the 1890s, across Europe and in the United States, you begin to see a flourishing eugenics movement that had as its emphasis the creation of institutions where those who were judged to be the weakest could be segregated, could be separated out. And if you could stop them from procreating, stop them from breeding, eventually those traits, those people would be eliminated. And he saw this, and advocates of eugenics saw this as a positive, constructive element of social progress. And so throughout New England, in Pennsylvania, beginning in 1851 at Elwyn, and then at Polk in the 1890s, and then in 1908 at Pennhurst. And I think maybe we could go to the next one. And eventually across Pennsylvania, the Commonwealth will support 60 different kinds of institutions intended to marginalize and to separate out those with undesirable traits. They could be physical traits, they could be mental health traits, they could be cognitive developmental traits. You see on this map how they were dispersed from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh and then north. The most famous of these institutions are the Western and the Eastern institutions for the feeble-minded. One was at Polk, north of Pittsburgh. The other was right here in our backyard, the Pennhurst State School and Hospital. And the idea was to marginalize folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities and to keep them from procreating, and eventually that population would disappear. And this is what gives rise to Pennhurst and all of the controversies that we're going to talk about. At the same time, Pennsylvania is opening both private and public institutions for the deaf, for those who have limited or no hearing or speech, for those who have mental illness, tuberculosis. There's a whole range of conditions, and institutions are created and supported by the state for the purpose of trying to separate out these populations. The idea was that these institutions, from the Western Pennsylvania School for the Blind and then the Deaf, all the way to Overbrook and the Pennsylvania School for the Deaf in Philadelphia, and every place in between. The idea was that they could be agents of human progress. These were all institutions supported by the state. Some simply received grants, others are state created, managed, and operated. At its peak, Polk, north of Pittsburgh, had over 3,000 citizens, residents living there. Pennhurst had over 3,000 people living there. Those populations were confined by law. They were restricted in their civil and their social rights, in their movements. You could not leave. You could not interact with members of the opposite sex. The idea was complete segregation. If you can stop people from associating, which was the late 19th century word, then you would stop them from reproducing. And eventually the populations would die out. Elwyn was a little bit different. Elwyn was a private institution that received state funding. And it was never quite as large as Pennhurst or Polk, but it was just as significant in its own right as one of the first institutions for the so-called feeble-minded. You'll hear talk tonight about language. The language that is used to identify these different populations that are to be segregated out include such phrases as the feeble-minded, and then idiots, morons, and imbeciles. These are all words we're very familiar with today, but they came out of the genetics program categorizing different degrees of intellectual and developmental ability. These institutions were created to marginalize those populations. And what you get is a mix of people with very different talents, skills, levels of learning, behavioral, social, and cognitive realities. So it's a very mixed bag. And as my friend Jim Conrad would said, who wouldn't want to live with 3,000 of their closest friends in a dormitory style building? At places like Polk and Pennhurst, to a lesser degree at Elwyn, at Hamburg, and other smaller institutions, they became centers for medical research and medical experimentation. The most famous case is probably Polk. When Jonas Salk needed to test his vaccine for polio in the 1950s, where would he find a ready population of people who didn't need to give their consent for treatment because of awards of the state? And how would he get easy access to this population of Texas vaccine? Well, he went to Poland. And he got permission to give his vaccine to otherwise healthy, uninfected residents who had no right to leave, had no right to disagree on treatment. And it was out of that that the polio vaccine was developed. At Pennhurst, some of the earliest tests to combat influenza came out of vaccine trials sponsored by the University of Pennsylvania and also the federal government. And Pennhurst had numerous outbreaks of influenza because their residents became infected with influenza and they had no immunities, no ability to fight the virus. And eventually, a more successful vaccine was developed. Measles and mumps, the vaccines were tested at Pennhurst. Hamburg, up a little bit north and west of here, did hepatitis research. And there were hepatitis germs that were put in food that students would eat every morning. And then they try to gauge their reactions. So these institutions became centers not only for medical research, but also some of the most cruel experimentation of vaccines. And it was a practice that lasted into the 1970s until Pennsylvania put a ban on further medical testing at institutions. Most of the larger institutions that developed out of this program, Pennhurst is a prime example, were overcrowded from the very beginning. They were unhealthy, they were unclean. There was a culture of mistreatment and abuse and neglect. And there was also day-to-day physical, psychological, and social violence perpetrated by the staff, perpetrated by other residents. Roland Johnson, who I'll speak just for just a moment, said the worst times at Pennhurst were at night, when there was little staff around and there were patients, residents, free to wander the halls and do whatever they wanted, and to get down into the subterranean tunnels and do whatever they wanted. And they did. And both male and eventually female residents who lived on their own campus, just off the main campus, they became the victims of rape. They became the victims of punishment and psychological torture, if you like. And these places embodied what James Cone called the terror. So what was to be an institution for the treatment of individuals who already were vulnerable became horror shows. And I use that phrase for a moment, as I'll show you in just a minute. Go back. Much of this research is sponsored by the United States Army, the federal government, and leading universities across the country, one of which is the Children's Hospital and the University of Pennsylvania. These institutions gave scientists ready access to large populations of people who would then be open to medical testing of one kind or another. To make a long story short, not sure how time-wise. Make a long story short, beginning in 1945, things start to change incrementally. And there are a series of events that expose the hidden conditions at places like Polk in Hamburg and at Pennhurst. There was a mother's campaign, and women whose children had intellectual and developmental disabilities began to investigate on their own. Pat Clapp, Eleanor Elkin, and Jenny Thornburg, who will eventually become the First Lady of Pennsylvania. They went around to these institutions and investigated, and they found children locked in cages, locked in closets, and otherwise mistreated in a variety of different ways. And they were horrified. There was little education. There was a great deal of abuse and neglect. 60 semi-naked children wandering a day room all day long, defecating in their clothes, and no one paying any attention. There were a series of deaths that were hard to explain, but they included instances where somebody just threw a child out a window in the second story and let them fall. Another time, aides were giving somebody a bath and nobody checked just how hot the water was. And that child burned as a result, burned to death as a result of being just held down in the water, though it was scalding hot. Women had no privacy. Men had no privacy. And for Jenny Thornburg and Pat Clapp and Eleanor Elkins, they were stunned. And they began to report what happened. Some of the conscientious objectors from World War II who did alternative service at these centers and hospitals, they began to write to the federal government. They wrote to Eleanor Roosevelt and to others, saying what the experience was like. And eventually there are advocacy groups like the ARC and a number of others that begin to pay attention. And they grew into some of the most formidable advocacy groups, not only in Pennsylvania, but also around the country. All of it exposing what was going on. Eventually, there's a documentary that was made. Has anybody heard of Bill Baldini and his documentary, Suffer the Little Children? You can go to YouTube and find it, and you should watch it. Bill was a young reporter from a television station in Philadelphia. He still looks like a movie star today. Bill went out there because somebody told him there was a good story to be had at Pennhurst. And he asked to be let in to film, and they said no. Then he asked again. He said no, and he asked again. Then he refused to leave unless he was let in with his camera. And they filmed the daily life of 3,000 residents, all of whom suffered some kind of psychological, social, sexual abuse, the mistreatments, the indifference of the staff. And after days of filming, this was broadcast in July of 1968 on Philadelphia televisions, and people were shocked. They couldn't believe that this kind of experience occurred in Pennsylvania. Not in America. How could this be? And as it turns out, the same thing was going on in Willowbrook. And the same thing was going on in Sonoma, in California, and all around the country. The nearly 300 institutions that existed were experiencing the same kinds of level of trauma. And suddenly, momentum builds for a disability rights movement. And by the 1960s, there is a concerted effort. It's a grassroots effort. It's in the legislatures. It's in the courts to combat these conditions. In Pennsylvania, there are 3 groundbreaking cases. We don't have the time to get into them in detail, but there's Park versus the Commonwealth, which challenged the lack of education that was going on at Pennhurst. And the United States Supreme Court will agree with the federal district court that this was a violation of someone's civil rights. Every child has a right to a free and appropriate education, a phrase that will be used in the law for decades to come. And so the right to education now is one. In 1982, Tom Gilhool, rest in peace, will build on Park in a very famous case, Haldeman versus Pennhurst, to challenge the conditions and the lack of services and supports and the abuse that is occurring at Pennhurst. Judge Raymond Broderick, who lived not far from here, will not only rule in favor of Terry Haldeman in the class action suit, he will order that Pennhurst be closed. This is 1977, it's finally decided. It's argued for the next 10 years. But the conditions were so bad, he said the only alternative is to close it. In 1982, Romeo versus Youngberg, the right to live in a secure and free environment in which one is not the subject of cruel and unusual punishment, Romeo versus Youngberg. And step by step in the courts and then in the legislature, this grassroots movement wins victory after victory. And as Judy Heumann and others at Roberts are arguing in California and New York about the right of access to transportation and other kinds of public accommodations, here in our own backyard, 3 seminal Supreme Court cases change the very nature of services and supports for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Out of this comes the IDEA, Individuals with Disability Education Act, and the guarantee of a free and appropriate education. If anybody's ever been through the IEP experience, the kids in school have a right to education. It all comes out of this. And it leads to the what is one of the most significant and least respected, least appreciated civil rights laws in the country, the Americans with Disabilities Act. President George H.W. Bush signs it in the summer of 1990. And members of all the different organizations are there. A group from Pennsylvania called Speaking for Ourselves, an important advocacy group that's still around. And then finally, a young man named Roland Johnson, who I'm writing a biography of. And there's a picture of Roland as right there, giving an award to President Bush. It is a singular achievement that now is being challenged in the courts, just as IDEA is being challenged and other elements of what are so-called special education services through the Department of Education. So this disability crisis leads to disability rights, and it leads to a movement for inclusion and opportunity. And eventually in 1999, the Olmstead decision gives an individual the right to live in their community, not to be consigned to an institution. It's one of the groundbreaking decisions in modern judicial history. It all stems from what started here in Pennsylvania. And so Pennsylvania, from the very beginning, is part of the disability movement and eugenics. It's also part of the disability rights movement, and it leads to some of the most significant judicial, legislative, and social achievements of the last half century. And folks don't know about it. They don't know about a Roland Johnson. They don't know about what was being done. And it's right here in our own backyard. And so when we think of inclusion, access, and opportunity, we think of disability rights. The disability rights are human rights. We should look to Chester County. We should look to what happened at Pennhurst. Now, a final thought. There are two developments today. They're the final insult. I think maybe it's my last slide. How many folks know about the Pennhurst Asylum? It's a Halloween haunt that makes several $1 million a year, none of which is turned back to the former residents or survivors. So there are some 300 still alive. And it is now, there's a Christmas pageant program being developed. And it's the most ghoulish, offensive, and ridiculous website you can find. Just Google Pennhurst Asylum and you'll see it. A celebration of Christmas and all of its horrors. For the residents of Pennhurst, there were enough horrors as it was. There's also a proposal, which is likely to pass, to knock the remaining buildings down to build a massive data center on the grounds of Pennhurst today, with no respect for the history, no respect for the people, no respect for the experiences of people. And it's likely to pass, despite some opposition. And so, as a way of concluding, the beat goes on. But we can look to Pennsylvania, we can look to Chester County to understand the origins, the nature, and the consequences of disability rights in modern America. Thank you. I'm sorry if I went too long.
No, you're okay.
I could listen to you all day.
That was, that was very insightful and very thought-provoking. Thank you so much, Dennis. Wondering if there's any questions for Dennis before we move on?
It's a question so much as I was a young reporter locally between 1975 and 1990 and was involved in the whole, spent time at Pennhurst. And what I saw, what I heard, what I smelled has just been seared into my soul even 40 years later. You cannot picture what it was like for those individuals. So when I see that Pennhurst Asylum, it just, I had no idea, it just rips at my soul. And when I hear all the talk about the creating institutions again and moving people out of the community and into these places, I can't help but remember the horror that existed. So keep that in mind. It wasn't that long ago, and it was beyond what you could possibly imagine.
What is your name?
Lisa Curtin.
Thank you, Lisa. Appreciate your comment there. Just, I need to pause with some of that. Again, at the top, in case no one heard it, I'm the mother of two neurodivergent, now young men. And to know that is the history of my state is just, it's difficult. It's difficult to hear and accept that. So thank you both for sharing. Anyone else have any questions for Dennis? Any questions for Dennis online? That was very heavy. Very, very heavy.
What I do.
No,
Thanks for bringing all that.
well, no, I say that to say only because sometimes when things are heavy, this is the part I was talking about at the top, right? We pause and we try to expand our thinking, and it forces us to reflect, right? We don't always need a question. We don't always need an answer. Sometimes we just have to sit with what was just shared. So it's okay if we don't have questions. That was a lot. And it makes us sad. And it makes us horrified. And I hope it makes us think. Yes.
Well, I don't know how relevant it is, but the reason that those institutions opened up, those facilities, and I may have missed this, I apologize. Like they were placed there or they were orphans. I mean, why did most of them even have to be placed?
Well, many of them, as the map shows, are placed out of the way. And that's intentional, get folks off the main street. But there were two ways that you could be committed to Pennhurst. One was family request. And that's Johnson's experience. His family just couldn't cope with his behaviors anymore. The other is if a judge or some other public official judged you to be, quote, mentally deficient and therefore unable to function as a productive member of society, you could be committed. It was not your choice. This is without consent, but it's either judicial, legal, or parental decision to place them.
And sometimes the parents felt they were doing the right thing.
Right.
They had the best intentions.
Right.
Until they saw
Right.
what happened. And then there was a huge movement by the parents.
Right.
That helped to lead the.
And now that you say that, I do remember hearing that back in the day, so to speak, it was considered bad parenting. If somebody was mentally ill, which is obviously what they were, it was considered like not genetic. It was considered, bad parenting.
That was Bruno Bella's idea.
Sir, I saw your hand up.
I know from the Dennis, and Charlie Martin like that. Another way that these laws can be used. Reading out that the students right in the early 1930s, one of the strike leaders was involuntarily incarcerated in a local mental institution by a local judge to break the strike against still. So this is another way.
Incarceration. Yeah.
And if I can just say, the language that was used was these were inmates. They were incarcerated. There were no polite euphemisms.
Right. So using law against the people essentially to further marginalize them.
Well, somebody's got to give their consent, but it's not the individual. It's a
not the
parent,
individual.
it's a judge, or it's a sheriff.
Hmm.
And once you're incarcerated, it's for life.
Right.
You don't have a say or a choice. You can't leave.
Right. Hmm.
Until the 1970s.
Till the 1970s.
Betty Potts is the first to leave the role.
And Roland Johnson, as your book talks about, was a big part of why folks today with disabilities, neurological disabilities, even have self-advocacy rights. And we'll talk about that a little bit later when the three of us get into conversation. But I'd like to move us along so that Caroline can share with us. We're going to move the mic just a second.
Hi, nice to be here. I'm the mic mover. So my name is Caroline, and my role tonight is to take what Dennis is talking to me about and bring it into today's world, and to talk a little bit about disability bias in life as it exists now. I thought I'd start with she'll never be president. That was the way that my parents found out that I was disabled. The doctor looked at my lab values, they looked at some of my gross motor skills, and said to my parents, well, she'll never be president. And when you asked about, how do people get into institutions, this was 1982, early 83. And at that time they did bring up like, maybe there's a sheltered workshop or something. So I think even at that early time, they're already sort of pegging towards an institution. Put myself right. This is very recent history. So I was born in 82. I'm 42 now. And that is smack in the middle between when IDEA passed, IDEA, which guaranteed the right to an education. So before then, if you were disabled and you did live at home, which, not everybody was in institutions, there was no right to a public education. So if your parents advocated for you to be educated, that might look like a tutor coming once or, an hour or two a week. It might look like, if you were very lucky, getting bused to a school where you would be in your own disability classroom with kids from kindergarten to 18. Getting a very, very, very rudimentary education that really didn't match the learning of that. So you'd have 18-year-olds who couldn't read. The amazing thing about those classrooms, though, were that they really fostered some of this modern disability rights movement, because kids started helping each other to learn, and they saw what it looked like to learn how to communicate with each other and to look at how to advocate for each other. So 1990 ADA, and ADA is this, as Dennis said, this incredible civil rights law. But it does, just like any giant piece of legislation, it covers the big buckets like education, employment, building access, but there's also enormous carve out areas. So houses of worship don't need to be accessible. Historic buildings, if you walk through Westchester, you see, Westchester shops, restaurants aren't accessible. They're not covered by ADA, but it's an enormous step forward. I also want to point out two big buckets of sort of ways and lenses of looking at disability. The first, we probably are familiar with, even if we wouldn't refer to it that way, and that's the medical model. The medical model looks at what is wrong with a person. So what are the barriers in that person's thinking, in the way that their body moves, in the way that they are psychiatrically to work. And where it comes from is actually pretty incredible. So in 1940s, soldiers are coming back from World War II and they're surviving their injuries. So for the first time in history, you can survive a major paralytic injury. What is more sympathetic than our young boys coming home from war, paralyzed and now needing to parent and raise their families and work? And before, they would go to a place like Pennhurst, they can't care for themselves, but they've got these sympathetic, people say, and good press, people saying, we can get you back to work. We can get you back so that you can be participant, members in society. And so that's where rehabilitation came in. So physical therapy, occupational therapy. So it's all geared towards getting somebody back to work. So as a kid, I had physical therapy, I had occupational therapy. I think I have cerebral palsy, so I walk with crutches. So that model is, hey, let me professional, get you disabled person as close to normal, as close to working functional as we possibly can. The deficit in that way is firmly with the individual. There's some, and so for me growing up, what that meant was I'm going to work as hard as I can to minimize all the parts of me that are disabled. I'm going to work as hard as I can to do physical therapy, to do occupational therapy, and to take what is broken and wrong and make it as small in my life as it possibly can be. Went through school, got to college, went to college. My first class in college was disability history and culture, which I'd signed up for because I needed to sign up for a freshman seminar. And I thought it was the first time in my life I had ever heard of the social model of disability, which looks at disability, not just from that medical view, but also at how our culture, treats people, how disability can be created through attitudes and through lack of access. So it really focuses on the environment that disables people, not just, and roots that in society and societal expectations. And it totally blew my mind because I'd never learned about this. I'd never learned that there were people like Judy Heumann and Ed Roberts and these people that had fought so hard for ADA. And I'd gone to an extraordinarily progressive high school. We were doing LGBT things in the early 90s. We were doing, incredible things with civil rights. And I'd never heard of anything connected to disability history because my teachers had never heard of anything. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that. But the idea that it's just not part of education. So I was shocked at many. So I'm going to move. So this idea of sort of telling stories became a big theme in my life. So as my day job, I'm a pastor at First Presbyterian Church around the corner. So I get to hang out with many of you throughout the week. But ministry is all about taking, big stories and connecting them to individual stories. And so I go, doing my work. I get married, I have a kid. We'll talk a little bit more about parenting with disabilities in a bit. But I was looking, my son was 3. I was looking for a book where a parent, not just the child, had a disability, but the parent in a picture book had a disability. And I could not find a single book on that subject. So I reached out to a friend of mine from college who also is disabled, also parenting, and she's a writer. And I said, hey, do you know of any books like that? And we could not find a single book with a disabled parent. And so we wrote one ourselves. And because she knows this world, we ended up getting it published. We get a second one published on a communication. And then as a result of joking around and talking about how very boring our lives were, now parents, we said, remember when we used to be young and fun? And then that came a book about disability and dating and relationships which was the most fun I've ever had, just interviewing tons of disabled people about their dating lives and their relationships. And then off to the side, we worked with Judy Human, and we have a book coming out under her, with her next year, posthumously for Judy, about work. But all this is to say, we were taking stories. No one had told stories about disabled parenting or disabled dating. It was the first book on either of those subjects. And so it just shows that I think so much of the time, those stories just aren't part of the conversation. And I will give the doctor his due, that I'm never going to be president. So he was totally right there. So
You don't want that.
I don't want to be president. Right. So I thought, in thinking about disability bias, what do we talk, where do you approach a giant subject like that? And so while this is by no means conclusive, the two lenses I wanted to approach it with are the lens of erasure and the lens of objectification. So to start with erasure, just a question for you all. So take a moment, just think, growing up, do you ever remember seeing a doll with a disability, a disabled character on TV, who wasn't the object of pity or charity? Do you remember seeing a disabled person having fun, going to a concert, participating in an event? And I wonder, just actually by show of hands, do you remember anything like that growing up? Okay, yeah, I don't, yeah.
The closest is maybe Abby from Sesame Street.
Abby from Sesame Street.
Very
That is super recent, but very, it shows things are getting better. Yeah. So, so when you think about that, how do you imagine then that lack of representation might impact both disabled people and non-disabled people? And this is a question, not a rhetorical question.
You're raised to, like, speaking from experience, and we're also people with disabilities, you're raised to think that your disability isn't actually a part of your identity, and it's something that shouldn't be celebrated. It's something that's shamed.
Yeah. Yeah. It doesn't belong. You don't belong.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
It means you don't know what other people experience. You don't know what common struggles are. It means you don't know their ideas. What are solutions for, I have this problem, my clothes don't fit when I have a wheelchair.
Yeah.
You don't know how to modify your clothes. You don't know the other people who might have ideas. You don't know because you can't communicate it. The ideas and the solutions, the things that are normal, the things that lots of other people might be experiencing, because you're stuck within only your own experiences.
Yeah.
I saw one more.
I was just gonna say, I don't think there's conversations, like, so folks don't know how to engage in conversation about disability, or saying the words disability, or asking someone about their disability, and just having conversations about it.
Yeah, and that's the impact on able-bodied people, right? Like the awkwardness of not being able to engage.
We have a couple of online comments.
Yeah.
Please.
So Judy said FDR having polio and not being able to walk was hidden on
Yeah.
purpose.
That's shame, right?
And Melissa said you should move on and not talk about the disability that you experience daily, because that is not proper public discussion.
Oh, yeah.
So those mental models that Dennis talked about still exist on a cultural level, right?
Yeah.
And I think not seeing someone on television or in a doll as who you are limits what you think you can be. You know, as a girl, I can't be president. I don't see a female president, you know,
Right.
it kind of limits your dreams, your aspirations, because you don't see anybody like you doing life.
Right. That diversity doesn't exist.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's the whole idea behind inclusion, I think, the law and everything, because the more that, you know, that population is merged with the quote unquote typical population, then everything will just, you know, it's like black and white, like for a long time, it was illegal for people of color to be married, you know, and now it's like, it's common to see it, you know?
Right.
And
Integration.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
that, and there's such, as you were saying, like the collective wisdom is just not there. If every generation has to reinvent the wheel, there's no passing down, there's no learning from each other. And actually so there have been disability advocates and people who have said, you know, there's a loss, as wonderful as mainstreaming is, and there's so many good pieces of it. Those classrooms full of disabled people helping each other, there was a plus to that too, because people did get to learn with and from people like them. And when you have one disabled kid in a class of all non-disabled kids, like, it's like, is that what inclusion looks like? And maybe not, you know, and so it's an open question. But as you can see, you know, that idea that like, people are, that experiences are erased. And it's interesting. So when we wrote our books, we interviewed people. We interviewed disabled parents and we interviewed disabled people who had, you know, were along every part of the relationship spectrum. And we always had this list, you know, of very, very simple questions and just sort of see where they went. And so much of the time, those questions ended with a lot of tears. People would say, no one's ever asked me how I parent. No one's ever asked, you know, no one's ever even acknowledged this about me. And those conversations felt so universal, even though they were about some very, you know, very specific circumstances. So while representation, I think the needle, we can very firmly say that the needle is moving in the right direction. This is a good, you know, yay, that's good. But erasure can look like lack of accessible seating in restaurants. So there's still so many places that like only have high tops. And I will, my very first advocacy ever was getting the frat houses at my college to have ramps going into them. Because while the classrooms were all accessible, none of the social stuff was, which is an interesting statement. It's like, you could go to class, but you can't have fun. Like, you don't belong here. And so that will always and forever be, I think, maybe my favorite advocacy project I was ever involved in. And they put in beautiful ramps to all the frat houses. So inaccessible restrooms, you know, homes and shops without railings. So I live in a very new neighborhood, like new construction, and they built all of the houses, most of them have steps out front and none of them have railings, which is sort of an interesting statement about like who's visiting you, or what if you become disabled? And then there is, you know, reality TV shows. I'm still not sure if there's any disabled people except for Niall DeMarco, who's a deaf dancer and model who sort of represents us, but he is, you know, and then we also have, compliments often focus on erasure. So compliments, you know, I don't see you as disabled. I don't see, you know, you're so much more than your disability, which if you think about, if you said that to somebody around a racial identity or around a sexual identity, you'd be like, oh my gosh, that is horrible. But it's still very common around disability to say, oh, I don't see you as that. And then there's still those euphemisms. So we could get into a language rabbit hole very easily, and I don't want to do that too much, but that idea that we can't just say disabled, that it has to be, oh, well, you're not disabled, you're differently abled, you're this, and that idea of like having to create a euphemism because the word disabled is just so scary. So a couple of examples of erasure. So the first is healthcare, and I'm just gonna give a couple. So, disabled kids, you rarely get age-appropriate, evidence-based, reproductive healthcare. It's just like, oh, you're not gonna be in a relationship. There's that tacit assumption, you're gonna be in a relationship, so you don't need this stuff. Which is interesting, because that comes from, so in medical schools, in nursing schools, in social work schools, they're not teaching it because there's an assumption that it's not there. Even though disabled people do get married, they do parent, and disabled women in particular are 3 times as likely to be sexually assaulted or abused than non-disabled women. So if you think about a high-risk population, that's the people that should most be getting this, but don't get it, by and large. So the other thing is that doctors regularly discount disabled people's pain or experiences or quality of life. And I put that picture up of me and my husband because I had knee pain, like horrible knee pain after pregnancy that went on for years and years. And I went to, the very reputable doctor, very nice guy. He said, oh my gosh, there's no way you can get a knee replacement. People with CP don't get knee replacements. And anyway, you're fine. Like, it's not like you're running marathons. I went back again, and said, it's still awful. Like it's still, and my life is getting smaller and smaller because my knee is just hurting so much. And he said, no, really, like you can't get a knee replacement. So I don't know why I didn't do this beforehand, but I Googled, do people with CP get knee replacements? And it was like, absolutely, like first Google response. But it, not everybody does them. I went to this amazing surgeon at NYU, and this is the picture now that she uses with her students because this is us hiking. And actually, Peter and Elizabeth, you were on this hike, it was horrible. So those big smiles, we were very hot. It was very long. But she uses this picture with her students to say, quality of life is important for disabled people too. And we also want to be out in the world and doing things that we love to do. And then also the other part of this is that people sometimes get pressured to go under very painful and maybe not super successful operations in the service of just looking more normal. And so people, especially with facial differences, there's this sense of like, oh my gosh, you will do anything to look normal. But the person's never sort of given the other options of like, what would it look like not to go through all of these medical things? So that's one section. The other area that I think is marriage and parenting. And so ADA, ADA is an extraordinary set of laws, but it doesn't cover everything. No civil rights law can cover everything. And one of the things that it does not cover is access to marriage. So we live in a world now where marriage is seen as a fundamental right. And I quoted, Overpel versus Hodge, many of us are familiar with. But there's many disabled people, especially who rely on Medicare, Medicaid, cannot get married without losing life-saving healthcare and benefits. And when I wrote Dateable, we did a chapter on finances, and I thought, I'm going to debunk that. I don't know why. I was like, I'm going to go into it. I'm going to find this can't be true. Like, let me find what's actually there. And the more I researched, the more I realized it is absolutely 100% true. And many disabled people can't even be in non-married partnerships because for a variety of reasons that are too much for us to get in. But basically, it is very hard, like marriage is not a guaranteed right for if you're disabled. And I don't think there's a group of people out there that are actively thinking, oh my gosh, let's keep disabled people from getting married. It's that these laws were designed with the assumption that they wouldn't. And it hasn't caught up yet. The other thing is that people with, there's very few social, medical wisdom out there that's accessible for people who are parenting or contemplating parenting. And even the other day, I was talking to a young woman who desperately wants to be a mom, and she had never seen another disabled person do that. And so that idea that those resources just aren't out there. And actually the woman who's in that picture is my friend Jessica, that's her family. And she wrote a great book on disabled parenting. and some of the joys, but also some of the ways that like disabled parents get reported to CYS at a much, much higher rate, even for things that like a non-disabled parent wouldn't get reported for. So there is always that fear. And then one of the reasons why I wrote the children's books was not just so that disabled parents could read to their kids, but so that disabled kids could see themselves one day as parents. Because we didn't get that. The other thing I want to go into, and again, I'm probably going too long, but the idea of inspiration, and I'm going to use the word inspiration porn, and I'm sorry for the sort of crassness of that term, but it's a big one in disability world, and it's the idea that like disabled people are often the objects of feel-good stories, but those stories don't actually make us feel very good about ourselves. And that we, just by existing, are inspiring. And we're not inspiring each other, we're inspiring non-disabled people. There's a couple, Me's on Wheels, if you're a social media person, following people, there's lots of great disabled activists online, and Me's on Wheels has some great, like she's fantastic. So I highlighted that one on purpose. But one of the things I call the buddy dilemma, and it's the idea of sort of generally infantilizing people with disabilities, but also that idea that so often the language that we use around, the language of sort of real authentic friendship is twisted around when it comes to disabilities. So we might have like a buddy program, you're my special friend in schools. But like, if you're honestly, are you actually friends? Like, do you hang out? Do you call each other? Do you share back and forth? Is this, sort of by any definition of friendship, this is probably much more a transactional, charitable relationship than it is the sharing of a life and experience. And so I think that language often we're sort of okay with in disability world, but not okay with in other, I think most of us would probably not be okay being somebody's like special buddy. They also, there's that idea that like, in terms of disability porn, that disabled people tend, especially in an age of social media, get photographed sort of at our worst times and shared. So this video was taken in a mall. This young man on the right was having difficulty eating, didn't have the tools that he needed to eat. And so another young man sat down without asking this guy's permission and started feeding him. And somebody saw this, thought it was the most glorious thing, started taping it and shared it broadly, saying like, oh my gosh, look how wonderful the guy with the hat is. Like, isn't that great? She didn't ask the disabled person, like, are you okay with me taping you and sharing this moment that was probably really hard for him? It was meant to make non-disabled people feel really good about themselves. And so that idea that like there's just that people are meant to be looked at for the benefit of others. And I've never gotten that extreme, but I did get somebody who one time who said, you look like you're really struggling right now. Can I take your picture and show it to our town council to share like how hard this area is? And I was like, I'd rather you didn't, like, I don't want to look like, I'm like, you look super unattractive right now. I'd love to share this situation broadly. So that idea that like, oh, you're going to help me do something that I really need. So the idea that's communicated is like, obviously these are damaging messages, and I probably don't need to belabor that. But that idea that like you exist for the benefit of other people. And that extends sometimes too to people asking, asking about medical history, like, so what's wrong with you? And sort of expecting a real forthright response, in the middle of your grocery run. And which is very different than children. And well, that's a subject. Children are naturally curious. They are wonderful at asking really good questions. But I think adults, I'm like, if it's not polite to, if you wouldn't ask somebody on the bus, like, so how much do you weigh? Like, are you on? Don't ask somebody about the disability about their medical stuff, like unless you know them very well. So I'm going to go, all right. So what's going well? there's a lot that's going really, really well right now. Part of disability is just out in the world a lot more. Part of that is the result of a generation of ADA, so people are able to get out more. There's more pressure for people with disabilities to be cast in movies and shows as themselves. And there's many more disabled content creators who are getting out sort of the real life about disability. And there's also just more focus, like you can watch Crip Camp on Netflix and just these incredible films. And there's also really cool things with like accessible makeup brushes and fashion and all kinds of things that are coming up. So the needle is moving very much in the right direction. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. So, because they are so wonderful, we don't really have much time for questions, and that's okay. We all move at the pace that we need, and we're all pausing and expanding, as we mentioned at the top. But I will ask one final question before we close this evening of our guests, of our panelists, and that is, if there's one thing, just one, because we learned a lot, you hope folks walk away knowing about disability bias or rights based on our conversation this evening, what would it be?
I think for me, it's just, people, we might move differently, we might think differently, we might look different. But fundamentally, the desires of people to have dignity and choice and authentic relationship are all the same. We all want that. Yeah.
Absolutely. Dennis, what's your one thing?
Probably echo that sentiment. Everybody needs to be loved. And it's too easy to take anyone for granted, but particularly for
Mike,
Hold on.
Mike person.
see if I can remember.
I'm looking out for you people all the time.
Everyone needs to be loved.
I'll echo what was just said. I've learned from experience, and we're parents of a son with disabilities. Everybody needs to be loved and not taken for granted. And so to have a heart that is both generous and compassionate, and then to act on that, is probably the greatest social force I can think of.
I couldn't have said it better myself. Love is the way, people. Keep it at the center. And I promise we will all be all right. Jennifer.
I did want to mention for the people who are viewing online, I had a few comments while Caroline was talking.
Yeah.
Regina is a social worker and has assisted many deaf couples in adopting deaf children. She did note they were not allowed to adopt non-deaf children.
Interesting.
And like getting closed captioning for films and in museum films is still a nightmare. And the closed captioning for this online presentation has left a little bit to be desired, but it's a work in progress.
We're all a work in progress.
That was my comment, not Regina's comment. I've been watching the closed captioning. They're struggling with some words.
Yeah.
And Melissa also said that there are many people that are, quote, afraid of disabilities in real life too. My epilepsy is not visible, and so many others tell me it should not be discussed.
Mhm. Well, hopefully yes.
I like to help people. The other day I was at a parking lot and there was a guy in a wheelchair and he's trying to load things into his truck. And I watched him and I thought, I just have to ask. And I said, hey man, are you okay? Do you need any help? And he said, yeah, man, I'm okay. But I didn't know really how I should have gone about that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think you went about it exactly right. Like, I think as if you see somebody that needs help, disabled or not, saying like, hey, can I give you a hand? Can I give you a hand loading groceries? People ask me that and I'm like, yes, I do want to have. what's not okay is starting to load the groceries in, which you didn't do, or grabbing somebody and pushing them or something. So don't assume, just ask. And I think we could all ask each other if we need help a lot more frequently.
Yeah, consent can extend to able-bodied folks, to disabled folks, to everybody. We should all be asking, is it okay if I help you in this way? Because even those of us without disabilities sometimes don't want help or don't necessarily, or I should say, don't necessarily want that in the moment, right? And for a myriad of reasons, who knows why. But asking for consent, I would concur, is the best way, right? To interact with anyone on any level. And with that, my friends, Ellen?
Thank you so much.
Staying
This has
tonight.
been amazing. This is great panel, great moderation. First-hand observation and experience that the only reason Caroline is not the president is because she doesn't want it. She would be an excellent president. That's all I can say. We've all talked about how high or low the bar is. The exhibit will be open for a little while longer if anybody missed part of it and they were coming in here first. Zip over to the museum if you would like to, and thank you so much for coming. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, everybody.
And we will have copies of Pennhurst and the Struggle for Disability Rights signed by this fine gentleman over here for $29.95, which is a discount off the list price if you would like to pick one up.
And thank you to other folks that are available online.
Great weekend.
I'm gonna come up here this speaker. Someone online asked the name of the last speaker again. You would have been the last speaker, so Caroline Cup, right?
Yes.
Do you wanna, just spell it out in your
Yeah, my name is Caroline Cup. It's Caroline, like Sweet Caroline, and then last name is C-U-P-P. Yeah, and I've got a woefully out of date website. It's www.carolinecup.net.
All right.
And I work on it. I know about the owl. I used to with the owl. I didn't have to say the owl. Thank you again.